Hi, I'm Michael, and this series presents a deep dive into a secret that I've been keeping for most of my life, but one that should never have been kept at all. It's my hope that learning my secret and the insights it has given me will help you understand either your own secrets or those of at least one person near to you. These audio episodes were originally recorded and released as a single 7.5 hour long video on YouTube. That video was really just me talking to the camera, so other than a few title cards, one thumbnail, and some body language for context, you're not really missing anything by listening rather than watching. Either way, you'll hear my message. That said, I only got asked to make an audio version after the original video was completed and released, so please understand that this introduction, my spoken trigger warnings, and the episode structure and breaks have all been hacked and hammered in after the fact, and please also excuse the few references to this video and the thumbnail. I don't think there will be anything too confusing in audio form, but if there is, a link to the original video is in the show notes. Also in the show notes will be links to any references and resources I mentioned in this episode. There are 8 episodes in total. Please only listen to them in order, as that order has been very carefully and very painfully chosen. This is episode 6 out of 8, Self-Recognition. It discusses my first truly serious mental health crisis and how resolving that crisis, alone and unaided, required developing an extremely dissociated relationship with my body, allowing me to push it to ever higher and lower extremes. Hi, I'm Michael, and I am what would popularly be called a psychopath. A functioning psychopath, arguably a very high-functioning one, but still very much a psychopath, albeit one whose innate propensity for violence has been directed inwards. I learned this basic fact on my 16th birthday, and though it's taken me decades to finally be able to disclose it, I can confidently say that the truth is, I am a psychopath. Now again, I use words precisely, and the term psychopath has many imprecise meanings, both in common popular usage and in academic fields. Etymologically, it just means suffering in the mind, which is pretty benign as it applies to pretty much anyone in possession of a mind. But thanks to its imprecise usage in a lot of bad media, it's a word a lot of people associate with criminality and thought-terminating ideas about evil. They think of it as a negative. I don't, though I do see the irony that a psychopath wouldn't. Psychopathy isn't a diagnosis. It's not a disease. It's just a blurry word used for a set of traits, and not even the professionals have ever been able to agree for long on what that complete set of traits actually is. But that said, across the history of its usage, there's some common agreement on 3 of those traits. And so because I haven't found another word that specifically encompasses those traits, I'm going to use the term to refer only to those 3 common traits. Those traits aren't negative or bad or evil. Those kind of value judgments are just meaningless thought-terminating cliches. They're just traits that the psychopath might use to justify their actions, or that other people might use to try and understand and explain, at least to themselves, the actions of a psychopath. From what I can see, the 3 traits that come together in every definition of psychopath are the same. They have no innate morality. They don't have or exhibit empathy with others, and they hide both of those behind a mask of normalcy. By that definition, I am certainly a psychopath. First, I have no innate morality and no built-in moral compass. There is nothing whatsoever, not now and not ever, telling me that any action I might take or consider taking is either right or wrong, good or bad. While I have taken actions I've eventually decided to regret, some that have harmed others, but most that have harmed myself, that regret doesn't stem from any internal voice telling me that action was wrong and me choosing to ignore it or failing to heed what it was saying at the time. No, there is only, and only ever has been, silence. And I wanted to hear it. I've yearned to hear it. In the years since that first crisis, I've searched in places and religions and temples you've probably never heard of for it. I've literally circled the planet several times, straining to hear. In all the cathedrals and mosques and the courts and the capitals, there's only ever been silence. agonizing, empty silence. I have never, not once, heard even the slightest hint of any such a voice, either in my head or in my environment, and I'm beyond the point of absolutely certain that I never will. In every holy book, every scripture, every legal decision, manifesto, constitution, and treatise, there is, and only ever has been, the mutually and self-contradictory voices of other men, and the voices of a horrifyingly small number of women, when the men could be bothered to keep writing those down. There is no law or authority or God that can convince me that right and wrong or good and bad exist. They don't. They're just thought-terminating cliches. And for the law or authority or God to persuade me, they'd have to rely on forcing me to either hear that voice or at least think I heard that voice, even if they were that voice. And again, there's never been the slightest evidence of any such a voice from any source. I've listened hard, but there is only, and only ever has been, silence. And honestly, if I ever did hear such a voice, I'd be certain I'd finally hit the point of driving myself to a psychotic break, of falling into delusion, because I've never met a single human being who claimed to hear such a voice that wasn't also, and very clearly, delusional. Second, I have absolutely no capacity for empathy. I cannot feel what you feel. In fact, I cannot even reliably feel what I feel. I have emotions, certainly, but they're just wave after wave of intense, chaotic noise, fundamentally no different than overly bright light or overly loud sounds or the bright, sharp taste of salt or sugar or, for that matter, piss. They're a stimulus, often an extreme stimulus, sometimes an overwhelming stimulus. But they always have and always will arrive from afar and in a disconnected, jumbled way that I can't discern any meaningful signal from. I experience my emotions. It might be more accurate to say I suffer them, but I don't feel them in anything remotely resembling a meaningful or decipherable way. There's no semantic value in them. I can pretend there is, and for brief periods of time that pretense can even appear convincing. That's how delusion works. But just like finding faces in clouds or constellations in the movements of the stars, there's nothing actually there. Your emotions, if anything, are even less meaningful and more indecipherable for me than my own. On the third point, well, that's simple. I've already described and named my mask. I very much doubt that anyone who has ever met me, much less heard me or spoken to me, would believe I've got either of the previous two traits, even after I've explicitly said that I do. Maybe the greatest possible proof of the fact that I am a psychopath is that right now, in this video, I've been telling you I am one the whole time, from the very beginning, and yet you probably, even to this moment, are trying to find excuses for why I can't be, because my mask doesn't resemble what you're expecting. I can also, though, confidently say that I am a functioning psychopath. My mask is very, very well developed. It's very good at manipulating others in order to ensure I survive. It should be. It started practicing when I was 5, and it was immediately tested by either having to do its job right then and there or not ever get a second chance. It was fit for purpose. It was very fit for purpose. That's why my body survived what my fundamental self, the thing many people today would call an inner child, didn't. And over the years, it's put a great deal of attention and energy into hiding the fact that I'm an empty shell hollowed out by violence from those around me. The fact that empty shell grew up to inhabit a tall, white male body with a deep, resonant voice and a long beard, and all those things unconsciously signal authority and knowledge and trustworthiness in you, in all of you. That extra bit of cultural inertia just made my mask that much more functional. I also have my hypervigilance, which took a lot longer to come online and mature, but is now so deeply ingrained into my entire lived experience after that moment that I can't actually tell where it ends and where my intellect begins. Back then, I know I was an idiot, if maybe a bright idiot. Today, the whole world sees me as intelligent enough that before I let my brains get damaged by someone else, those brains were enough to get me into Cambridge. But as far as I can tell, I'm only as perceptive and smart as I am because I needed to be to survive. That at least simulation of intellect provided by the hypervigilance helped me improve the at least simulation of empathy that is the mask over time, and vice versa. Slowly and in an undirected manner, they allowed me to assemble a very crude mechanism for also simulating both morality and empathy while having neither. But by 15, that forced feedback mechanism had just barely started to mature. If those two survival mechanisms twisted together in this very conflicted, very agonized child in this critical moment hadn't been pushed over the edge by just one more absurdly violent act, heaped atop a lifetime of absurdly violent acts, I wouldn't have eventually learned that I always was and always will be fundamentally a very high-functioning kind of psychopath. Instead, I'd have died acting as a non-functioning one. I'd have exposed myself that day by killing my rapist, her family, and myself. I discovered I was the functioning variety when, in my first real experience of psychological crisis, I met my inner psychopath and the utter moral void that lies beneath it. And in the abject horror of that meeting, I made a conscious choice to hide him and it, and therefore me, from the rest of you. My immediate problem was that I didn't know how to trigger that choice on my own. In the storytelling meaning of crisis, it's the moment where a critical decision has to be made, where everything comes to a head. And I've already told you, I have no moral compass and no empathy. I couldn't resolve the crisis by selecting the morally right path, and I couldn't do it by considering how my rapist or my mother or anyone else might feel about my choice. I had been left, either by nature, if I was born a psychopath, or by nurture, if my history of childhood abuse and neglect had made me one, without what psychologists call an internal locus of control. Now again, this may be my confirmation bias speaking, but I'm going to suggest that any adult who feels that they have an internal locus of control is delusional. They just haven't been robbed of that delusion yet by the arrival of some external actor or force powerful enough to overwhelm them and strip them of it. And if they can't imagine a force powerful enough, well, that might be because they lack my experiences or the freedom of imagination that they have given me. Because for any force you can imagine, I can imagine one that's stronger than it. My hypervigilant and admittedly psychopathic mind knows that somewhere out there, rushing towards us at the speed of light, is the wave of radiation so intense it scours this solar system of everything remotely resembling life or civilization as it arrives. My locus of control is, and always has been, light years away from me and millennia outside my lifespan. I had no moral compass, no empathy, and no delusions to move the needle. I had anger, intense anger, because I'd allowed some external actor to damage me as a child, and I had discussed that I'd now allowed another external actor to damage me as an early teen. And together, in this moment of building crisis, I'd developed intense impulses towards violence, up to and including a well-rehearsed plan for that violence. But I was waiting for some external force to tip me over. That's when, in a phone call on my 16th birthday, as I was teetering over an actually terrible precipice, deeply and emphatically wanting to die and deeply and emphatically yearning to kill to do it, my rapist, thankfully, did me an enormous favor, and in turn, maybe did one for you. She decided to just shove me right over the edge. The specifics of what she actually told me will remain between her and me because, yet again, The details are difficult for me to get near, and the ones I can remember clearly are both too specific to be of any help to you, and, frankly, are gross and uncomfortable enough to pass into the obscene. All that's necessary to understand is that in the middle of a conversation with a victim and boyfriend who was contemplating killing her and her family the entire time, unbeknownst to her, she so misread our conversation that she thought it was a good idea to convert yet another revelation of yet another infidelity that my depression had somehow driven her to engage in into a kind of phone sex. One moment, I was in the middle of struggling to convey to someone with a tiny vocabulary just how deeply and personally and painfully being exposed to a risk of sexually transmitted disease without my knowledge or consent had violated my trust. I was trying to tell somebody that I felt like I'd been raped, and the next moment, I was given exceedingly lurid, actually pornographic details of another, unknown, extremely unsafe violation that exposed me to much, much worse risk than the worst possible thing I had yet been prepared to imagine. And the woman on the other end of the phone, honestly and clearly, didn't do this to harm me. She simply wanted to arouse me and somehow thought that this was a good idea as a way to accomplish that. The following passage contains brief descriptions of violence and injury detail. There have been several conversations in my life where I suddenly realized that the two people involved weren't even in the same solar system, never mind on the same page of the same book. This was the first. My body knows what it feels like for a child's face to be slapped across the chin by an adult man's hand, so hard it tore muscle and tendon in my neck. My body knows what it feels like to be kicked in the skull by the combat-booted feet of two meaningless, emasculated drunks, and the agony that does to those same muscles as your head gets spun around further than it's supposed to and your brain splats up against your skull's decelerating limits. Though I really don't want to retell the full story here, I've even been hit in the head by an elephant's trunk hard enough that my forehead met my knee at speed. And while that's funny, I can't imagine how to relate the months it took for my brain to stop sloshing around back and forth within my skull, and for the muscles and tendons around the base of my neck to slowly knit themselves back together. Well, both my body and my brain knows what it feels like for one psychopath, who I can't really blame because of what I choose to believe were her experiences of far worse childhood and adult sexual violations than ever occurred to me, to so completely lack anything even remotely resembling a working moral compass or empathy for another, that it feels like your head has spun around through at least 720 degrees. To have been decapitated so thoroughly that your mind and your body will never, ever be able to fully reconnect. To have been hit so hard, so shockingly, that it will spin you, against your will, from the drunken, comfortable, everyday delusions of just being human, right through sobriety, and out past and onto the other side, knocking out even the possibility of ever clinging to the raft of another delusion. If you're a fan of Terry Pratchett, you might recognize this as having achieved nerd, the state at which no amount of alcohol can ever make you drunk again. If you're not a fan of Terry Pratchett, then all I can say is that's too bad and try harder. That conversation was the very first time I looked in the mirror and fully recognized my psychopath looking back at me. She hadn't held up that mirror, she was that mirror. She'd just shown me that she was a psychopath. She knew nothing of right and wrong, or good and bad. She just thought she did because she'd been sold some twisted, contradictory, just wrong ideas from a book she'd never actually be able to read in the first place. And if she'd been equipped to empathize with anyone, she couldn't possibly have made the error she'd just made. Her psychopathy had suddenly snapped into the sharpest focus you can possibly imagine. It had driven her to this act and all the ones before it. And that had just exposed me to precisely what she was. And then that recognition, dawning, exposed me to precisely what I was, to the same degree of focus. If I'd had the moral compass I'd been taught to imagine was real, I'd have recoiled from her long before now. If I'd had any real capacity for empathy, I'd have already known she didn't. No, we were both of us psychopaths. I didn't know then if we were both born psychopaths or if we'd both been made into psychopaths by the violations of adults and then peers we'd each similarly endured. But what I did immediately know was that we weren't the same species of psychopath. The following passage contains descriptions and details of acts of self-harm. Earlier I described how, in my explorations of preparatory self-harming, I learned that pleasure and pain are actually precisely the same sensation, just at different intensity levels. They really are. Both are merely electrical signals transmitted along our nerves to the sympathetic nervous system. And while pleasure is a slightly more coordinated, rhythmic, pulsating signal, and pain is a somewhat more chaotic and staccato one, the reality is that they're really only differentiated from each other by the context we're in, and there's a point of intensity where one just becomes the other. Someone who has only experienced whatever falls inside the spectrum of normal may never learn this. They never get to actually embody it, much less understand it in a repeated, empirical fashion. But as I've described, I have a number of experiences that fall well outside the normal range of that spectrum. My disassociation allowed me to treat my body like an experiment, and I cut into it like a surgeon. Only a surgeon trains on a cadaver and only ever works on someone that's anesthetized. They don't get to feel it themselves. I did things Mengele never did. I vivisected parts of myself. That gives me a kind of very rare, very specialized expertise. Strike a nerve directly with a sharp steel needle you've only crudely sterilized with a Bic lighter, and with hyper-vigilant senses, feel what happens as the muscles around it leap and twitch and shudder. And you know the pain is just pleasure you don't want to know you can feel. Keep pushing. Just to understand that little bit more, that's when you learn you can exceed the threshold capacity of those nerves and push into a place where you don't feel any sensation at all. The place where there's nothing where the body should be. Instead, there's just the shadow of a body, a deeply uncomfortable and disturbingly familiar void. Suddenly you will know that your body senses can betray you. Though I can't explain why, I can't explain that, this knowledge will bring with it a kind of contempt for your body and its limits. That it will become to you a shameful, loathsome thing, in part because it's let you treat it so poorly. It gave up signaling you to stop. What is harder to explain is that this contempt frees you from those limits. It grants you a kind of power you didn't have access to before. Harness it, and you'll always be able to push your body well past the point where debilitating, agonizing pain is supposed to stop you from continuing. Push yourself hard enough past your body's limits, and you discover it might not have any. In that moment, on that phone call, as I received the worst birthday gift of my life, a gift that might seem kind of meaningless or even a bit comedic to anyone else, but has left me seriously contemplating ending that life the morning of every single 16th of December since, just so I never again reach the hour and minute an alarm goes off in my head and I know that I received it. I learned that love and hate are precisely the same emotion, that all of what we call emotions are the same emotion, just at different intensity levels. Just as pleasure and pain are merely crude electrochemical signals traveling fast around our nervous system, our emotions are just crude chemical signals flooding slowly through our endocrine system. Again, it's the context that differentiates them. The who and what we're looking at when the signals get strong enough and the heart beats faster and the blood starts to heat our skin and all of this noise starts to push against the threshold of our conscious attention. And yet again, I learned that keep pushing those signals hard enough and you find yourself looking face to face at the you that doesn't feel any emotion at all. Or rather, at the absence of you, where in the place you've always been told to expect a soul, there is nothing but an unfathomable, unfillable, unquenchable void. A black hole where a human should be, a yawning dark. Suddenly you will know that your body's feelings can also betray you. And again, I don't know why, but I learned the hard way that this knowledge brings with it an even deeper kind of contempt. It's just not just your body that will become to you a shameful, loathsome thing. It's all the bodies, everybody's body. In part because yours let you abuse it so badly, it revealed to you that it had never, not once, actually been signaling you to stop. In fact, it had been pushing you forward full throttle the entire time. And it recognizes that madness in others. And again, what's harder to explain is that this contempt also frees you, not just from your limits, but from those of the people around you, from the emotional shackles of your society that it has impressed upon you, but never actually explained or justified. It also grants you a kind of power you didn't have access to before. Harness it, and you'll always be able to push your body well past the point where shame, grief, hate, love, pride, fear, or even disgust, yours or someone else's, are meant to stop you from continuing. Push yourself past your body's emotional limits, and you discover there is nothing innate, no inborn, hard, unpassable limiter or governor stopping you from harming yourself or others. Both of those are radically powerful, literally liminal moments when you pass a threshold you can never, ever go back on. They're the moment you click a ratchet forward and you reach a place you never get to retreat from. You literally can never unsee what you've seen there. Before them were both ignorance and innocence, where you got to see the glass as half full or half empty. After you know those two are precisely the same thing, and that the only thing that matters is what is in the glass. Step across those lines even once, and you can never, ever cross back to that earlier country. Your life as you knew it is over. You, as you've known you, has just died. That's why many, maybe even most human beings will only reliably reach and pass those two thresholds once at the end of their lives. I'm now pretty certain that's because these thresholds are something our animal bodies and the mind that rides around in them have evolved specifically to make the experience of dying less painful and terrifying for the semi-conscious than it otherwise would be. My worst ever birthday gift was the sure and sudden knowledge that I'd passed them both before. At the beginning of our relationship, she'd reminded my body that it had been raped before when I was 5. At the end of our relationship, she reminded my mind that it had been killed before when I was 5. I received the gift of knowing, really deeply knowing, that I am a husk, an endless, unfillable void, ever so briefly wearing the skin of a person, and that I'd been fatally wounded at least twice by other husks, ever so briefly wearing their own skins. A human being really isn't meant to pass these thresholds multiple times. They're not equipped for that, either by anything they're born with or anything they're provided by their parents or their society. Neither nature or nurture presents a human being at any age with the tools necessary to endure both the annihilation of their will and what is rape but the complete destruction of the illusion that your consent matters to the rest of the universe, and the annihilation of their ego. And what is death but the complete destruction of the illusion that your identity matters to the rest of the universe? But when it happens to a child, all that child can do is assume this is normal, this is what happens, and start preparing for the third time and the fourth Throughout this video, I've tried to provide enough context to understand the idea of reliving, how that can occur in the form of flashbacks, and of how the horror and discomfort of that reliving drives avoidance, which can present as hypervigilance and disassociation. I've explained how reliving and avoidance set me up for re-victimization, driving me into the arms of a recidivist, and how, at the start of that relationship, too much intimacy from someone with too much knowledge, far, far too fast, had pushed me into my first live flashback, and how something in my brain just gave way, and I found myself disassociated for the first time. I've gone on to describe just a small amount of how that really very toxic first relationship played out, and how it had led me to experience really quite severe self-harming, still in that disassociated mode, and how that had metastasized into first depression, then suicidal, then homicidal ideation, leading to this first conscious experience of what would eventually be many crises. I'm trying to describe and explain a serious mental illness from the inside as it developed, how CPTSD in a deeply traumatized body and mind turns that mind against itself and the body it inhabits. Untreated, left to its own devices, the terrible, unspeakable, unbearable agony that's caused by any sensation of reliving, any sense that you're currently in yet another echo of whatever that first traumatic moment was, will eventually push that body into an unbearable crisis, where it either needs to die to avoid feeling, or it needs to feel to avoid dying. When there's nowhere safe to go, and no one safe to reach out to, that tension has to ground itself somewhere, and it will eventually choose whichever path feels like the least resistance. The problem, to put it extremely bluntly, is that just like with a lightning strike, there are 3 possible outcomes. Either someone has already and very thoughtfully installed a nice big copper cable, and it grounds safely, which means you're already in the care of someone responsible who has either been here before or has been properly trained and equipped to deal with the disastrous. Or that disaster is going to fuck you up, or it's going to fuck up someone else. What distinguishes species of psychopaths is their path of least resistance. In my case, at this moment, the path of least resistance was through me. I was going to fuck me up. I'd already been struck by crisis before, you see. The shortest path to ground had already been discovered, but in all the prior cases, it was someone else's crisis that did it. On my first day of school, that bus driver's crisis grounded through me. A pedophile, especially of the stranger danger variety, is a psychopath whose path of least resistance is through the weakest and most vulnerable around them. And how pathetic, in the sense of truly sad, is that? My father's crisis, and then my mother's, smoothed and polished the way, training me to internalize my emotions rather than express them, to accept and absorb, to reshape my body and its expressions of emotions to their needs and the bounds they'd learned from their society. The typical bullying violence of teachers and students had waxed and honed it even further. By the time I met my rapist, she became my rapist because her crisis found its way so easily to ground through me. Again, through a vulnerable child, down a nearly frictionless path that had already been prepared. This time, once the charge built up enough and she intentionally shoved, because her psychopath's actual goal was goading me or someone like me into putting her out of her misery, and the shortest path to grounding her pain was by shoving on mine, and that shove tipped me over that tiny bit. There was no other path it could possibly take but through me. What I needed to die to avoid feeling then, what my psychopath has always existed to protect me from, and what I now need to feel today to avoid dying, are rage, horror, and shame. And again, those are all one and the same thing, the fundamental, single, only actual emotional sensation of being human, just at different intensity levels and driven by different needs towards different ends. Before I lost my emotions, before I really deeply realized that I was a psychopath, capable of disassociating from even the concept, never mind the feeling or perception of human emotion, before I decided to hide that simple fact, one that feels like an incredible relief to finally say and gets easier to say each time I say it from the world, I still, in a misguided and delusional psychopath's way, felt like I loved my rapist, that I wanted to protect her, even though I'd been driven to the even more misguided point where I felt that putting her out of her miseries and me out of mine would somehow be protecting her and me from the weight of everything our earlier rapists had done to us. Or at the very least, I'd be protecting the future of children we'd both meet and put at risk because her psychopathy had collided with my own and left her a rapist of children and made me one that just hadn't raped a child yet. After she shoved, the moment my head spun round at the blow and the crisis arced through me, and I saw me for what I actually was and actually knew, that the very last thing I wanted to do was end her suffering, I'd ever so briefly started to feel rage at her revelation, incandescent, impossible, heart of a star level rage, and for a fraction of a second I wanted to direct it at her. But I couldn't. For one thing, I literally couldn't. She was at the end of the phone, not at hand. If she'd been at hand, maybe I'd have snapped and throttled the life out of her and grounded it out that way. But in the real-time moment, I quite simply couldn't. And I couldn't direct it anywhere else either. Remember, as I said, I'd always directed my anger at objects, not people. But there weren't enough walls in British Columbia to punch this kind of rage out on, and my hands wouldn't last anyway. I couldn't even really express it as anger. It was too big, too loud, too overwhelming and oversaturating, an echo of thunder so close it had blown my ears out. So my psychopath rose up and my emotions just shut off and everything went muffled and silent. The following passage contains a description of an act of self-harm and a dissociative episode. I don't remember exactly what I said. Probably because in the thunder of that silence I literally couldn't hear it. But I know that before I'd ever come close to realizing the shock I was in, I'd very coldly, in a dead voice, broken up with her, after telling her she'd deserved whatever her father and brother had done to her that had driven her to do what she'd just done to me. Afterward, I developed intense guilt and shame over that, but at the time, there was just nothing. Nothing whatsoever. It was just a fact being stated by a thing that couldn't feel anything about that fact at all. Then I watched myself hang up the phone, go into the kitchen to start a pot of water boiling, then head to the bathroom, where I half filled the tub with water and lined up a wedge of soap and a piece of pumice my mother used for treating calloused feet along the rim. I watched myself turn off the faucet, strip off my clothes, and wrap myself in a towel, then walk back to the kitchen, bringing back the pot that had reached a rolling boil. Then I locked the door behind me, sat down in the tub, poured the boiling water over my genitals, then silently started to scrub at them and my inner thighs with the pumice and the soap, until the flesh was pink and raw and bleeding. Then I pulled the plug and watched my sloughed-off skin lazily circling the drain. I just wanted to be clean, scrupulously clean, to be rid of her filth and their filth, and if that meant maiming the parts of my body that had been touched by her and by extension them, then my psychopath was there to redirect the rage I probably should have felt towards her and them towards those parts of me. And so I didn't get to feel that act at all. I get to see it. I know it's real. But it feels unreal because the thing we're supposed to think of as me, my inner self, my I, didn't feel anything whatsoever. Not pain, not agony, though if I push hard enough or get triggered badly enough, my body can remember both, as well as the pain that came later as the skin eventually healed into scars that can't be seen because of the loose, deflated skin from all my weight losses. It's the other way around from my first day of school. My body's memories are difficult to access, but my mind's episodic ones are clear, and I can see every step I took and everything I did. I can see the damage I did, and I can see the skin peeling off as it healed. I just see all of that through entirely disinterested eyes. Eyes set in a body that felt no emotion whatsoever, not even an inkling then, and feels nothing but shame about any of it since. Eyes that would never, it turns out, look at the night sky again and focus first on the stars, because now it really knew, just how much vastly more dark there is than light. This thing I ride around in, this body, it couldn't let my mind touch the rage, and it recoiled. Snapping back so hard, I remembered what I really am, and what I found there horrified me. Not in the sense that I feel horror as an emotive response to what I'd seen, no, but in the sense that my hypervigilance reached out into my immediate future and started pinging incredibly loud and incredibly close about precisely what horrors the humans, especially the adult ones, around me would inflict on my body if they ever got even the slightest glimpse of what I'd just found in my mind. In that town in Abbotsford in the early 1990s, the great and the good and the many, many weak and the stupid who listened to them were constantly frothing at the mouth about Satan and witchcraft and demons and cults, and a lot of kids I knew in that town had suffered real and substantial and ongoing violence at the hands of those adults just because they'd played Dungeons and Dragons or snuck out to a party where there was a Ouija board. And their kids could be just as violent. I'd personally had to learn I could run just fast enough to outrun a church group after the wind kicked up and revealed a bad death metal band's demonic mascot on my t-shirt. This newfound psychopath's immediate problem was surviving in a town where adults who truly believed they were righteous and had a book to back that up would beat their own kids past the point of addiction and sometimes suicide just because they imagined in them what really and verifiably was in me. I didn't believe for a second then, and I don't really believe now, that most humans who have ever lived could be trusted with meeting my reality. So it became my secret. Just one more anomalous horror I'd experienced but couldn't safely tell anyone else about. In the decades since, I've realized it's just another survival mechanism, just another pre-written program any of us can go down, and one we will go down if we're ever faced with a crisis we can't and don't get to resolve on our own. If we're either fortunate or unfortunate enough, depending on your perspective, to get pushed off the edge and be forced to fall into our deepest possible depths. In that moment, on that day, from those depths had risen the Leviathan of my inner psychopath, as I now recognize it did on my first day of school. And to protect me again, it chose again to compromise me again. It fawned, protecting my social self when it couldn't or wouldn't protect my actual self. And in doing so did what likely is irreparable harm. It stepped in between me and all of that rage and all of that horror, and it had turned all of that really righteous fury inward, because in me it had been told nothing else, shown no other option. My anger at being betrayed again, and not being allowed to consent, the opportunity to consent again, was simply too intense for any other capacity I knew about to handle, and so my acute stress response went down the same basic path again. When someone who should have known better took their inner violence out on a child and made me justifiably angry, and I'd tried to express it, the anger, not the violation that caused it, had been too much for my father and mother to handle, and they'd used violence on one hand and starvation on the other to bend that anger inward and try and get me to just stop expressing it. Knowing nothing else, I'd continued with their bad lessons and kept bending it inward. I'd kept myself silent, hitting objects, never people, hurting me in favor of hurting them, even when they definitely deserved it. And then, when I'd allowed this broken woman, who by her age should have known better than to violate a child's safety and trust just because hers had been violated, and that violence had made me justifiably angry. Every expression of that anger had been met with what I only decades later learned should be called gaslighting, bending it further inwards. So now, when my rage got pushed past the point where I'd have to express it, I hammered that inward-facing weapon all the way home. I didn't get an opportunity to feel that anger. I can still just barely try and touch that rage, because the instant it happened, my psychopath grounded this new unfathomable rage into my body by forging it through another unspeakable horror into the core of unbearable shame that I've been carrying with me since my first day of school. Into the mass at the center of me, where I put every punishment I've received for whatever unknowable thing it is I did so wrong that I've been put here on this planet to receive it. Hi, I'm Michael, and on the 16th of December 1990, on the day I turned 16, in the bathroom of the house my grandmother owned in Abbotsford, British Columbia, I was murdered, again, by a psychopath, again, by me, and again, not an exaggeration. The thing I knew as Mike had died when I was 5, and the thing that eventually started calling itself Michael died again when I was 16. Every time I needed to die to avoid feeling, or feel to avoid dying, I died rather than feel. I didn't choose to. I didn't get to reach that point. I don't know if I'll ever get to reach the point of choosing. Now, on that first recurrence, and on every one since, I just discovered that I'd automatically followed, once more, a path I'd automatically walked down before. From the very first time violence touched me, and on, right up until today, any and every time I've been impacted by actual contact with death, serious injury, or sexual violence, or been pushed close enough that I've been sufficiently reminded of an earlier impact, I've absorbed that energy, amplified it, and then turned it against myself. The kicks in the head didn't hurt. I barely felt them, but I've been in agony since because of how much I want to feel rage and loss and grief, but can't. 2 weeks ago, I saw a child snuffed out by violence. But while my brain keeps replaying to me precisely what I saw, the injuries and the horror that I saw, what it simply won't allow me to do is actually feel what I know I must, or at least should, somewhere, somehow, feel. But I can't access any of that, except more shame. Each successive trauma twisted into a chain with all the others, each successive violent visit leading to revisiting over and over, a cycle, an orbit. Run away, then towards, each inward swing getting closer and closer to smashing into the center, each outward fling feeling like almost but never quite reaching enough velocity to escape. And at both extremes, it's my body that takes the damage from all that momentum. Exactly as with my weight, inextricable from my weight, I cannot emphasize that enough. My weight and my history of self-harming are just different expressions of the same thing. This reliving is just another kind of fugoid, and again, you do not want to be in an uncontrolled fugoid. The sad fact is that at 16, I had no idea whatsoever that I'd entered one, much less how to escape it. I'd just come face to face with the terrible secret at the heart of me, and my survival instinct was to hide that secret, certainly from everyone else, and if possible, even from myself, and so I wrapped it up in the same familiar blanket of shame that my parents had thrown over it the first time it had been even partially exposed. And then I tried hard to avoid thinking about it. But I only had the idiot toolkit of an idiot kid raised in what can only be called an idiot town at an idiot time. And that's if we're being generous. I'd learned that my body's senses weren't reliable, and I'd learned that its emotions weren't reliable, so I took the idiot advice of the idiot media I could find in the idiot 90s, and I followed that, like you guessed it, an idiot. The following passage contains brief descriptions of disordered eating and self-harm. I meant relying on my instincts, which are just as unreliable, and my initial instinct was to hide the evidence of what I'd been doing and make myself so strong and powerful that I wouldn't be bullied, beaten, or raped anymore, and that meant losing the weight and putting on muscles people could actually see. So I switched off the self-harming and switched on the same eating disorder I used to lose weight that brought you to this video. I had learned that I could go to the extremes, and so I just stopped eating for the first time. And again, I did that in a dangerous, foolhardy fashion because effectively all I'd done was swapped the self-harming of cutting my forearms and burning my inner thighs for the self-harming of cutting out food and burning too many calories. That meant I also flipped from undiagnosed and untreated bulimia and binge eating to undiagnosed and untreated anorexia and food avoidance. Unfortunately, because there really are never going to be any secrets for weight loss, that took the weight off, again, too quickly. And seeing the numbers on the scale too quickly ticking down rewarded the part of my brain that enjoys those extremes and tries to push me to them. At the same time, I started going to the gym, and because I had a lot of extra reserves to burn and had learned that I could trivially push my muscles and then my joints and my bones well past the limits of lasting irreparable damage, I started packing on muscle stupidly fast by lifting weights far heavier and more often than was ever remotely safe for a 16-year-old boy. My body image, of course, was as distorted as ever, so after just a couple of months, I'd exchanged an extreme urge to lose weight for an extreme urge to gain muscle. Torn cartilage and permanently damaged joints be damned. By the time warmer weather rolled around, I'd more or less succeeded. The first time I remember absent-mindedly pulling off the loose sweater that had been covering my arms, I looked up to see a class full of teenage girls and one not-so-teenage teacher looking at me with what must have felt to them like shock. My mask smiled. It blushed. My left foot screwed up tight and my mouth filled with the taste of copper. A class full of teenage girls and one not-so-teenage woman were looking at me with what felt to me like hunger, like desire. Were they going to want to rape me? Did they want those parts of my body to burn? That afternoon, some of the boys who'd beaten me for years started to jockey to become my friend. Others didn't, but would never even try to hit me again. Then one of the other boys they'd bullied, who I didn't know at all well, but who also struggled with weight, looked me up and down with interest. He said I looked good. And for the first time in my life, someone who shouldn't know I had one asked me for my secret. My mask smiled. It made my mouth give bad advice about bodybuilding. My left foot screwed up tight and my mouth filled with the taste of copper. A boy was looking at me, at my body. Was he going to try and rape me? Was I strong enough to stop him? How did he know I had a secret? I didn't know I'd entered a fugoid, and I didn't have a clue how to escape it. The tragedy, the real tragedy, is that at 16, even if I'd already had that metaphor to help me, I still had no one whatsoever to turn to for help when it started to swing. I'd always dealt with fear of boys, in part by carrying extra padding to protect me from their attention and blows. Now, fear of boys meant getting stronger, getting bigger, finally getting to the point where I couldn't be harmed again. That meant lifting weights beyond the point of damage, and that brought on extra muscle mass. And perversely, that meant my weight and my BMI got higher, even as the padding burned away. That meant I slipped right back into a place where, when I finally told a doctor I thought I might have an eating disorder, that doctor first told me that I couldn't have one because I was male, then looked at my BMI without actually looking at my actual body and told me to my face that I was morbidly obese, that I needed to lose weight. My muscles and veins were already grotesquely prominent and visible. I had very little subcutaneous body fat left, but I couldn't show that doctor the hidden folds of stretch-marked, obscenely loose and empty skin hanging off my damaged crotch and inner thighs. Once more, I needed help. Once more, I sought it from an adult. And once more, I was left with crazy-making feedback. So I simply couldn't convince my brain it wasn't losing control because of the pathologically violent intersection of numbers in the mind of a doctor with even less empathy than a psychopath. That drove me to try to starve, while maintaining the muscle mass, which made the muscles even more prominent, and perversely, that brought more female attention. And after my rapist, I was just as terrified of girls as I'd ever been of boys. Anytime that attention got too close to becoming the wrong kind of sexual, I'd find myself in another flashback, panicked, running on automatic, my mask fawning, and me coming around from another dissociated period, having traded somehow safer acts in exchange for not having to engage in the unsafer ones. Each reminder of recent trauma would push my mind back into reliving ancient traumas, and eventually the tension grew so great I had to fall back on avoidance. So not long after I graduated from high school, I flipped anorexia off and bulimia back on, starting a swing from the safety from judgment and physical violence found in being skinny towards the safety from unbearable emotions and sexual violence found in being fat. And no one knew this was happening. Neither the boys, all of whom I'm now in hindsight quite certain never wanted to rape me or really harm me, nor the girls, who, again, in hindsight, didn't want to either. Maybe if I'd been able to tell any of them what was really going on, I'd have found more friends and confidants and fellow journeyers. Maybe they and I would have known as children what we only survived and endured to learn a little bit about each other as adults. Those of us who did survive. Instead, I grew progressively more and more isolated. The following passage contains very brief descriptions of incidents of trauma exposure. I wish I could say that the story of my fugoid ends there, but as I've tried to make painfully clear, I'm still in it, and the point is, I always will be. The story continues. There were many, many ups and downs again after these. From finishing high school, swinging from down towards up, to nearly a decade later in university, where a downward swing was rebounded by not being able to keep the lights on during my first attempt in years to explore safer intimacy, which led to a massive flashback and a promising relationship shattered, and finally seeing a psychiatrist, followed by a terribly wrong diagnosis from an outdated copy of the DSM-3, then 4 years of being treated for a mental illness I never had by a series of doctors who outright refused to listen to their patient and kept deferring to the wrong diagnosis even after the right one became clear. I'd need an entire other video to explain how utterly debilitating it was to be on lithium without the manic episodes of a bipolar disorder I never had, to try and explain having your life made utterly devoid of any color or flavor at all, of having anything like emotional responses or even basic pleasure responses just snuffed out by what amounts to a chemical weapon for anybody except those who need it the most. 4 full years entombed within a body that couldn't feel even the muffled noise my psychopath couldn't interpret, stuck, paralyzed, unable to do anything but watch myself take a rocket ride up to 405 pounds, my personal highest single point yet on the merciless swings. Years spent growing more and more suicidal again, but with no emotions of any sort to lever against it. Nothing to put between me and my worst impulses. Interminable days after days of waking from sleep, begging to be put back to sleep again. Then finally deciding, coldly, it was time to die. The moment the tick-tock ratchet of my birthdays edged past the year 2000, I committed myself to not seeing the next. I was so impenetrably, unbearably alone. Then the 11th of September in 2001, and I'm knocked onto an unexpected, very different course by the apocalyptic shock of an entire planet joining me as one of the talking traumatized. The incredible perversion of realizing, knowing I wasn't alone after someone else I'm absolutely certain had persistent hypervigilance just like mine, precisely like mine, worked out in an incredibly psychopathic fashion that's far too familiar, how to knock down the Twin Towers and eventually take the world's superpower with them. Finding in that a disturbing reason to push back the deadline. Then taking myself off the medications, finding myself homeless. During another crash down by 160 pounds, terminating in yet another attempt to find my feet as a functioning sexual adult because I desperately wanted to be a dad, resulting in yet another flashback. This time not quite so scrambled, and another crisis and collapse and another inner death while watching everyone else's PTSD not becoming CPTSD and watching their reliving fade into the background while mine never does. Then the effort of digging myself out of that fresh grave after finally just tripping over the proper name for my disease. And that effort rewarded in meeting someone I think I can both stand and trust enough to have that child with, except years too early for me to not shove her up onto my damned pedestal. Then a move across a continent and finally finding a therapy group for other truncated men and slowly building a bit of hope around the notion of becoming a survivor. Hope cut short when I threw myself between her and the body of another truncated boy who'd put a shotgun to his chest and fired seconds before we'd arrived. The violence of him finding peace, turning my own mind into a maelstrom after learning precisely what it means to really know what red hot steel shot does to the meat of a human through hypervigilant eyes, fingers, and nostrils. Fleeing from that storm pushed me to make yet another move between countries, which left me trying in vain to swallow that fresh experience of violence and death by focusing first on a marriage, which was good, then a career, while the marriage wasn't. Another weight gain rather than betray, then a weight loss rather than divorce, then that divorce anyway, and another career, and some of the best friends, and then the worst loss, real tragic insurmountable loss. And how I met my father again after 25 years, but didn't get to ask him the questions the last remnant of my long-dead inner child needed before the answers died with him under a year later. From India and being punched by an elephant to Vietnam and standing beside an unexploded bomb. Then meeting the bravest woman in the world right after the man who doesn't know the joke of the universe, but he's sure he's the punchline, stumbled out of the largest cave on the planet. Joe and I circled the globe multiple times from meeting to getting married, and she's been with me and watched as my fugoid continued to take its toll. Especially after we learned we needed to get a dog because desperately wanting to be parents was never going to be enough to make me a dad. Its shifts and swings had gotten smaller. I'd gotten more resigned to just remaining high rather than fighting my own body. But then the toll started to grow again during COVID, while a small part of the world started to watch us on YouTube because being locked down on a narrowboat looked better and more interesting than being locked down in a house. And again, finding myself looking at a whole world of people with PTSD. Then watching it not become CPTSD, and again watching their reliving recede and fade while mine never does. And then 3 years ago, a doctor looking at my BMI without looking at my body and without empathizing with me at all, told me I'd hurt Joe if I didn't hurt me. So of course, automatically, I hurt me. I leveraged my secret. I reached for the one tool I shouldn't have, my ability to override all my bodily limits, my inhuman self-control. I did the one thing no one should be able to do. I flicked on my anorexia and pointed the nose straight at the ground. And it all would have turned out fine if I hadn't gotten kicked in the head just as I was, finally, trying to land this weight thing according to plan. Because I was going to land this thing. My weight was going to be a solved problem. Not only that, I was going to triumph by finally having another first day of school that had me go right this time. I was going to ace that master's degree, then a PhD. If I wasn't going to get to make my contribution by making the world a better place for one child, then I was going to make my contribution by changing the way we think about programming languages and how they can give people who only think they can think their first opportunity to actually think. There were books to be written. I was going to take my secret, keep it secret, and turn what it had taught me into a lever to teach the world how to make the world a better place for the world's children. I was going to finally break from the past and finally contribute to the future. And with that, I might finally get a glimpse of pride. It was a nice dream. I liked that dream. Given the nature of my secret and the nightmares that led me to having it, it felt like the way my story should play out, like a myth out of old, one in which I finally discover I've been the protagonist all along. Unfortunately, the truth is, I don't live in that world. I've never lived in that world. So the dreams I'd briefly let myself cling to were violently shattered by two morons too stupid to know they're not the protagonists either. Until I can set this aside and start to pick up the pieces of what remains, the story of my weights fugoid is frozen, stuck in a kind of extremely violent pause. Unfortunately, thanks to this society not being able to marshal any kind of a reasonable or coordinated response, leaving me responsible for something I really shouldn't be. I have no idea if or when this pause will end. I wish I could tell you this story ends happily. But the fact is, it's just going to end. Thank you for listening to Self-Recognition, the 6th episode of this 8-part series. My story continues in episode 7, Transmission Begins, available now.